All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, today we're going to be discussing a few more things about the Zodiac Killer, and we really have two things going on at once. I was encouraged by someone to check out the possibility of Robert Christian Hansen being a Zodiac suspect. Someone wrote to me twice saying that I need to look into Robert Christian Hansen, and more definitively stating, this is the guy. The Zodiac Killer was Robert Christian Hansen. So I thought I would give it a chance. And I did this about a couple months ago. I just glanced at the stuff about him, and I was just like, Robert Hansen was a serial killer that operated in Anchorage, Alaska. And I just really took a glance at the stuff, and I was like, wait a second, he left for Alaska in 1967, and of course the first Zodiac murder was in December of 1968, December 20th, 1968 to be precise. So it was like, I just kind of dismissed it completely, I didn't examine it any further. But in reality, there's an enormous story that is going on with Robert Christian Hansen, and that's some of the stuff that I've been going through more recently. Now, what are the sort of reasons why someone would think that Robert Christian Hansen, the Butcher Baker, a man who we don't even really know how many victims he killed and raped, because this is a big thing that we do need to know. He was also a rapist, which the Zodiac was not. But when you look at the sort of life of Robert Christian Hansen, starts out, he's born in Iowa. His father was a Danish immigrant. They didn't really get along very well, and he kind of just was always sort of kind of an outsider. He was someone who had very severe acne. He had a stutter that he never lost. The acne left him with scars, but he never grew out of his stutter. Some people have a stutter when they're younger, and then he grew out of it. No, he never did, and that caused a lot of trouble when it would come to things like relationships, especially things associated with approaching women, attractive women, things of that nature. That caused an enormous amount of trouble for him. And when I was reading through that, I was like, wait a second, doesn't that sound a little bit like the Zodiac in the sense that targeting lovers' lanes? There's definitely some sort of connection between the Zodiac Killer and women. I mean, jealousy, that's been talked about so many times as a potential Zodiac motive, just like rejection from society, jealousy, and also sort of this feeling of superiority. But some of the things also associated with Hansen is that to kind of, sort of the way he kind of channeled his energy for a while was into things like archery and hunting. I mean, rifle shooting as well. And he was actually very good at it. And one of the things about him was that he won hunting awards, and he even moved to Alaska. Part of the reason why he moved to Alaska was because they had better hunting. That was a big motivation for that. But we do need to know a big thing about Hansen. By the time, 1967, he was married, and he moved to Alaska with his wife. It's not like somebody who was a complete recluse for his entire life, and we've talked about a few cases like that, like Farley Llewellyn with the Mad Gasser of Mattoon, someone who is just always cut off from society. Eventually, Robert Hansen did get involved, with women. He did learn how to talk to girls. I mean, it's just that he could never get over those bad memories, like the rejection that he experienced in his adolescence and teenage years. Not to mention the problems with his father, that, not being accepted by his father, the bad father-son relationship. And, we're talking about the Zodiac Killer as well, so it's some of those things, I guess I could see kind of a motivation why someone would think that there's a connection here. Another big one is, we mentioned, very big body count associated with Robert Christian Hansen. We don't even necessarily know the exact number, and definitely not all of the bodies have been recovered. And there are even possibilities that he was murdering people in the lower 48 states before he made it to Anchorage, Alaska in 1967. But once again, that's just a giant question mark. Bear in mind, though, the Zodiac did say that he murdered 37 people, right? so only 5 of them we can really name very easily. I mean, there is that famous line that the Zodiac claims responsibility for 37 murders. I mean, the biggest thing, though, is hunting people down for sport, hunting people like they are prey. I mean, I think that was the way that I was introduced to the Zodiac Killer 20 years ago. That he was a person who hunted people for sport. I mean, that's what I believe that I heard the first time I ever saw something about the Zodiac Killer on a kind of TV show way back when, watching it on like Fox or History Channel, whatever was the first one that I saw. So I can see kind of the superficial connection that you have going on there. But what would be some other things about Robert Christian Hansen and the Zodiac Killer? Like, what are the differences? We talked about the things like rejection from society, problems with girls, a murderer. I mean, they're definitely both serial killers. Okay, we mentioned Robert Hansen was a rapist. The Zodiac Killer didn't really seem to rape the female victims. Furthermore, Robert Hansen targeted strippers, exotic dancers, prostitutes, and actually one of the reasons that led to his capture was he was targeting a sex worker, and she escaped. And, she was able to run down the street. She has her hands handcuffed. She's in her underwear, and she was able to wave down, like a passing motorist. And that was one of the pieces of evidence. But, of course, like, one of the sad things about this story is, like, she comes forward to the police. She tells her story. She's even able to kind of lead them to Robert Hansen. And one of the nicknames that Robert Hansen goes by is the Butcher Baker, because that was kind of his profession. He moved to Alaska and he opened a bakery. He was a baker also in Iowa. That's when he learned the thing, as I believe he was a teenager when he first got a job in a bakery. But he's referred to as the Butcher Baker in some of these things. Like the Nurture I'm Butcher Baker candlestick maker. And the police were looking into him at first, and then they were just like, he's just such an ordinary, pleasant human being. He's Bob the Baker. And I was like, this happens so much, where the police have the suspect in their sights and then they just keep looking in another direction. There's like, psst, there's no way it could possibly be this guy. And one of the serial killers that I was really reminded of was Albert Fish, because I remember the descriptions that they would say about him. No, it couldn't be him. He's just such a simple, plain old man. He's just sort of like someone's grandpa. No way he could have anything to do with this type of stuff. Yes, they can. I mean, and one of the things, though, with Robert Hansen is, we mentioned, he opened a bakery in Alaska, successful business owner. He owned a plane. Sometimes he would even put the victims on the plane and just, fly them to weird locations. He won hunting awards. He was an expert marksman. It's like he had so many things going for him. He wasn't like some degenerate that was, living out of dumpsters or something, who was just like preying on anyone who would walk by. No. I mean, he had so many things in life. He was married. He had children. He had the family thing, the business, the airplane. So many things going on. But he couldn't escape the bad memories that were associated with his childhood, as well as being rejected by women in his teen years, adolescence, not knowing how to socialize with them. Now, here's the thing, though, that really stood out to me. There's a pretty good documentary about this on YouTube. But I'm like, the documentary will detail everything much more elaborately. But the thing that stood out to me was Robert Hansen also had a long series of criminal behavior. When he was in high school, he was, sometime in his teen years. I shouldn't say he was in high school. In his teen years, could be like age 18 or something, he set fire to a building near the high school, though. I don't know if he was still a student at that time, but he set fire to one of the buildings. I believe it was a garage, and they didn't actually send him to jail for that. They sent him to a reformatory, which is like an institution, because one of the things about Robert Hansen is that he had bipolar disorder. So he spent 3 years institutionalized in this reformatory, which once again I believe is like a psychiatric institution. Okay, so look at the telltale signs of serial killing that we have going on. Rejection from peers, rejection from women, hatred toward society, setting fires, and you can interpret what you want about if hunting counts as harming animals. I mean, I'm not. One of the major signs of serial killers is that they like to harm animals, but he was a hunter, so it's like, I mean, you can kind of just interpret that the way you want. Maybe that is, maybe that isn't. That's a little bit different when it comes to something like hunting. I'm from West Virginia. I've known my fair share of hunters who would probably take an enormous exception if you were to say that hunting is harming animals. You know what I mean? Okay, so what do we have going on with him? In Alaska, multiple criminal offenses. You know, it's like there was the attempted assault of a woman. She was able to kind of fight him off, and I believe he might have had something like, the details are escaping me on the first one. It was like I believe it was an attempted rape. That once again, you know, he was even picked up by the police, but he didn't have anything for 10 years. They didn't have anything on him for the 10 years. Like, his history was clean for 10 years. No criminal activity for 10 years, you know. But the fact of the matter is, once you just look at it in the macro level, when he first got to Alaska, he was attacking women. They didn't seem to notice. Not to mention all of these things that he had going on. Granted, though, starting the fire in, like, the high school garage, that would probably be medical information if the courts determined that he was medically unfit and they sent him to the reformatory. That would probably be protected under a certain way. I don't know if the police, the local police department in Anchorage would have access to those records. Okay, so we definitely have some signs of mental issues going on. We definitely have, like, that, you know, that sort of sexual frustration that these serial killers can't get away from. Whether it's somebody like Elliot Rodger, the Isla Vista shooter, who was just, you know, wrote the entire manifesto, My Twisted World, all about how he felt like he was rejected from society because women didn't want to be with him. So he went on a shooting spree, and he said very clearly that it was because he was rejected by women. Not to mention, though, some other examples of people who just can't control their urges. Like, we talked about Moses Atole on this channel in the past, a serial killer from South Africa, who had just, Moses Atole had the ability to kind of just lure people out to remote areas, just that charismatic, persuasive personality, making the women feel safe, and then preying on them. Believe it or not, though, that's the way that Lyndon Lafferty described his suspect, George Russell Tucker, in the Zodiac Killer mystery. Like, what they say about George Russell Tucker is he would have the unusual ability to get someone to kind of come along with him, the unusual ability to get a woman to get into his car, that sort of personality type. And I thought we were going to be having that with Robert Christian Hansen. I really thought that they were just going to say all of those things about him. But the thing is, though, he more likely preyed upon sex workers. You know, like someone just getting in his car, not because he's extremely persuasive. No, it's because, I mean, you know, like he's like going up to street walking prostitutes and stuff like that and escorts, and maybe he can sort of get like an exotic dancer to come into his car for some extra money. Not exactly the same thing there. But a big thing with the Zodiac Killer is the Zodiac was not a rapist. Also, I mean, the sexual assault thing, that's quite a different thing that we have going on here. And, I mean, also, Robert Christian Hansen targeted most of his victims using a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. And it's like the Zodiac Killer, I believe, I don't think there's ever correct me if I'm wrong, Zodiac buffs, did the Zodiac ever use a rifle on any of his known victims? I don't think so. I think the Zodiac used handguns, more or less. Just kind of noting that was one of the first things that I thought about with this. You know, like, one of the reasons why I decided to do this upload was, I was like, maybe I was too dismissive. I mean, it's physically possible for somebody to take a plane ride from Anchorage to San Francisco, and that could have also been an easy explanation about why the Zodiac Killer was never captured. It would be something like, all right, they're actually looking for this guy who's based in Anchorage, Alaska, and he's only coming down to the Bay Area every so often. So I was like, maybe I was too dismissive, only because Hansen was in Alaska in 1967 and not in the Bay Area in 1968. But, it's like, to kind of say that, where's the proof that this guy ever visited San Francisco from 1968 to 1969? I mean, like, do we have any kind of sightings or admissions that he was there in 1968? I mean, I'm just not seeing the connection here. But, someone did kind of bring this to my attention and wanted me to look into this. And the case of Robert Christian Hansen, I admit, is, it's just, there are things to say all across the board. It's like, it's a horrendous case of a serial killer. And it's also like, you would really think, why didn't the police catch on more to somebody who did have a history of crime, who had the history of mental illness and violence? I mean, then again, though, he's Bob the Baker, he's running a business, wife and kids, he owns a plane, he wins hunting awards, he's just an ordinary member of the community, blending in with everybody else. But I think that also something else that could be that we could explore with this particular case is that two of Hansen's victims, they have found the bodies, and they have kind of monikers and pseudonyms attached to them, but they don't really know who they are. Two of the true identities of his victims have never been solved. They have never been figured out. And I think that could be something that would actually be kind of a good way to explore this case in the future, because just some kind of theories that we could compose about that. And it would also be something like, when you're dealing with these cases, not putting all the focus on the serial killer, not putting all the focus on the murderer, the perpetrator, but also looking at how these things affect other people. And maybe we could just kind of explore that possibility, like, who are these two unidentified victims? Once again, it's like they found the body, they know they were murdered by Robert Hansen, but they do not know their true identities. So we could really look into that. Although it's going to be hard to deal with stuff, because one of the reasons why people were attracted to Anchorage, Alaska at that time is that it was the frontier, and one of the reasons it helped Hansen escape capture is for that reason. Even women were coming up from the lower 48 into Alaska, and they were saying that they were leaving their families behind. We didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Instagram and stuff like that back in those days. So it's like people have the right to leave their families if they're over 18 years old and they didn't stay in touch. I mean, they have the right not to do so. So a lot of this stuff is that people are going off to this incredibly remote area at the time, that being Alaska, and they're getting just kind of estranged from their families and separated, and they lose contact. And that's one of the ways that Robert Hansen was able to operate, because he's choosing vulnerable women who just are most likely prostituting and becoming exotic dancers for the money, who don't have a lot of connections to their families. So it's much more difficult for people to report them missing. Not to mention that during the wintertime, Alaska also had an enormous amount of darkness. So there's a reason why they said there's that expression, he committed the crime in broad daylight. Well, it's easier to take cover in the dark, and it's easier to kind of elude capture when you're in the dark because you're less visible. I mean, Alaska had an enormous amount of darkness. So there are some reasons why Hansen evaded capture. But the connection with the Zodiac Killer, I'm just not really seeing that. Also, Robert Hansen didn't really write any ciphers, no history of him kind of doing anything with code breaking, although he did have a connection to the Army, though, so there could be something there associated with codes and and things of that nature. I mean, I'm just not seeing a big connection with the Zodiac Killer, but there is a story here, and I think that if we kind of explore the identities of a couple of his victims, it could actually be a bigger story. I mean, that could be the kind of, that could just be something we could investigate more on this channel. Well, alright, thank you to anyone who has listened so far into this. Alright, thank you so much. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button and subscribe. And most importantly, please leave a comment below, because I would love to hear from you.